In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, would like to welcome you to this Gulf Studies Forum in its 8th edition. Would like to welcome you to this second session, which is going to be a continuation of the first session, which is going to be about prospects of reconciliation. We have the pleasure to have you with us in this session, and we have the pleasure to have a number of speakers who are going to tackle a number of issues. So we have Dr. Mohammed al-Rumaihi, who is going to talk about the prospects of reconciliation, regional and international alliances after the Gulf reconciliation. And we have also Dr. Dhafer al-Ajmi, who is going to talk about Gulf knows greeting diplomacy. Is it a full reconciliation or a temporary truce? And we're going to have with us also Dr. Dr. Khalid al-Jabir from Washington, who is going to talk about Gulf reconciliation and international competition in the Gulf region. We're going to start with the paper by Dr. Mohammed Ghanem al-Rumaihi. Dr. Mohammed Ghanem al-Rumaihi, who is well known to us all, he is a professor of political sociology, and he has participated in a number of events and conferences, and he was advisor to Alam al-Marifa in Kuwait, and he was editor-in-chief of Al-Arabi magazine or periodical, and also got a number of cultural awards and prizes, and he has authored many books, articles in peer-reviewed periodicals about Arabic culture in Arabic and English. So many professors have graduated and he was their professor, and they consider him as their mentor. So you have between 15 to 20 minutes to present your paper, and after that we're going to move to the other speakers. Brother Abdullah, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you very well. First of all, I would like to welcome our brothers here today, and I would like to salute them and say good morning to everybody. I would like to thank you for the kind invitation from the center, and I would like also to thank you for convening this annual forum to exchange ideas and expertise. So the paper that I would like to talk about is about strategic variables and changes, and do not want to talk about the GCC difference or problem, because I have an opinion with this in this regard. And the paper is a 4,000 word paper, and what I'm going to say is going to be a summary of the main ideas that I have tackled in the paper, and I call upon Dr. Abdullah Baabood to notify me before the time allocated to this session, 3 minutes before the end of the session, for me to summarize the main points. So I chose to talk about the strategic perspective because I did not want or do not want to talk about the topical and day-to-day issues, and I have listened to parts of the discussion that took place in the previous session by colleagues, and I think that we do need to concert efforts with regard to discussions in this matter. We in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in the Emirates, there were so many wise voices that had an opinion, an independent opinion. vis-a-vis what is taking place. And they did not enter into any populous or popular disputes that have come to the surface after the GCC Qatari Egyptian conflict. We in Kuwait twice have issued a document vis-a-vis this particular matter at the beginning of the problem, and approximately 150 persons have signed this petition or document where they see a consensual kind of solution to the matter, because the main problematic in the minds of those colleagues that have signed this petition or document, and in my view, that everybody is threatened, everybody in this region, and I mean GCC countries, are threatened for a reason or another, and consequently exiting from the constants that we have and preserving the situation that we have now requires a great deal of effort. I do not claim to be wise in the paper that I'm presenting, no, but this is just a view, a vision that can be different from one person to another depending on his or her economic, cultural and social backgrounds and political positions. What I see, Brother Abdullah and dear colleagues and attendees, we are facing two projects. The first project that I entitled, which is Wilayat al-Faqih, so this is part of the 12th trend in the Shiite sect and its interference in the political sphere. So this is very much impactful on the region. So we have seen that manifest in many regions for political and cultural and economic and social reasons. And also we have the Sunni Islam and its use in politics and its use in the region. So we have two projects. We have the 12th, the Wilayat al-Faqih project, and we have the Hakimiyya project, the Sunni Hakimiyya project. And in the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen contributions to the developments that have been witnessed in the region as a whole. Some of them were impactful even before then. We're talking about Sunni Islam, as we know it, has reached power in countries such as Sudan in recent time, and it reached Tunisia, it has reached also Egypt, and Wilayat al-Faqih is present in Iran, and a number of our Shia brothers believe in Wilayat al-Faqih. I say a number of Shias and not all Shias. And there are a number of others who are outside this kind of calculation. So these two projects, the small countries and smaller countries and the relatively rich countries, are targeted by one of the two projects or both projects. And this is the crux of the matter here that I would like to talk about in this intervention. Some regional countries tried and decided and in actual fact concluded alliances with regional powers, and here I mean either Iran or Turkey. And I think that this alliance is harmful on the small country and also the region as a whole. And there are future threats and risks that would happen as a result of that. So the two projects that are represented by Iran Wilayat al-Faqih, and to some extent by our brothers in Ankara, the second project. They do not intervene in the region for no reason. No, they have their own interests that are known. So the possible losses in the continuation of this conflict between these two poles, the losses are going to be huge. And also there are social impacts that have happened as a result of the previous crisis. And as some have expressed, the outcomes are still continuing with us. We have seen the situation that I have described, and I might be harsh in my description, but I wanted people to understand that this is a kind of a political childhood that is being exercised by some who go and fall into a level of adventure in political work where you try to overuse your resources and also impact the social fabric of your own country. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, when it comes to small and medium-sized GCC countries, they try to blow out of proportion their capabilities. Some of us, they try to blow out of proportion their national identity and try to exaggerate our capabilities to be on par with larger countries. And in actual fact, these countries are small countries with limited strategic capabilities. Some of our countries, if they go to the airport, after 3 to 4 minutes, you would find the airplane outside the airspace of that particular country. So it only takes you 3 to 4 minutes since takeoff to leave the airspace of that particular country. So we have to be a little bit not too arrogant, and we have to understand this phase that we're going through. So, and we can only achieve our objective through mutual work. So countries, in addition to Jordan and Morocco, these are the two countries that have protected themselves and survived after the Arab Spring. So some of those countries have started revising some of their content, and this is something that is respectful. But some other countries are still continuing with their ideas, thinking that they have capabilities larger than what they have in actual fact. So there should be some kind of humiliation here. I have an expression that is a little bit exaggerated, but I see that some of our countries, their shade is much larger and wider than their own physical potential or presence. And as it was expressed by the panelists in the previous session, unfortunately, we as people who try to exert efforts, our voices are not heard by decision makers, or perhaps they are heard but not taken into account. That is why decision makers are busy with their day-to-day issues, their direct issues, and do not look at the strategic matter. So how can we move from this situation? I think we need to look internally. We have to look at the importance of reform inside GCC countries. And when we talk about reform, we talk about political reform, economic reform, and social reform. So there should be a modern project for the nation state, the states that can rub shoulders with what is taking place worldwide. That is why the internal situation in the GCC is very important, and this is also a reflection of its foreign policy. So the equation that I try to underline here, and that I hope would happen and manifest, so it is a win-win kind of equation or situation that I wish would manifest. So we would like to have all parties win at the end of the day. So we want to have an added value to our GCC communities and societies, and cannot deny that there are successes that have been achieved in some sectors, and cannot deny also that there is some level of coordination between these countries, but our ambitions, as our colleagues in the previous session, are much larger than all that. In conclusion, what I would like to say, what appears superficially and what is being discussed superficially on a day-to-day basis in our media, on our social media platform, are topical issues, emergency issues, but what underlines and what exists underneath is not discussed. Here we are talking about strategic transformations and changes that are taking place, and GCC countries are watching what is happening. They are watching the modernization efforts that are being exerted, and there are so many challenges that are existing. So we have the war in Yemen, and also we have penetration of regional powers, the level of training and political participation. All these aspects have a strategic dimension and hold so many threats as well as opportunities. So coordination between these different countries in their public policies, foreign policies, and also the complementarity and integration can lead to reducing risks and also to avoid what is worst. So we try to increase benefits and to avoid what is worse. So there is a possibility that the worst might happen in our region. This can happen for economic region. Perhaps there would be a decline, a quick decline in oil prices, or perhaps the impact of certain countries of the region. That is why we have to have political rationalization and wisdom that should prevail in this region. Brother Abdullah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. I think you also managed to respect the time limit, so thank you for that. We're very grateful, and for your contribution, of course. This kind of conversation has taken place before us, you and I, on many occasions, and you really gave me some good insights on that. We move now from Kuwait, from Dr. Mohammed al-Rumaihi, to another Kuwaiti brother who is here with us in Doha, thankfully, Dr. Dhafer al-Ajmi. and he is a member of Gulf Academics, and Dr. Dhafer is a retired colonel from the Kuwaiti Air Force, and he has a number of Arab peer-reviewed articles in journals, most recently Arab Gulf Security Evolution and Problems from the Perspective of Regional and International Relations, and also History of the Kuwaiti Army in 2004 and 2011 in Arabic, and the Kuwaiti Army in the Age of Mubarak al-Sabah from 1896 to 1915, which was published in 2000 in Arabic. Today, Dr. Dhafer will be talking about the so-called nose greeting diplomacy, as it's known locally in the Gulf culture. You have 15 minutes. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I will talk about the nose greeting diplomacy. I'll read a summary of my paper. This is a problematic term, even when it comes to translating it into English. I think I understand that they spent 3 days trying to find a proper translation into English for the term. It's been there for many centuries before the Gulf crisis. Sometimes it's called the way of Bedouins or Arabs of making peace and amends. There have been different attempts to cope with the changes and situations which have seen extensive use by actors in crisis who resorted to unconventional and untraditional ways and means, so much so that it has become almost impossible for traditional diplomacy to deal with the situation. Diplomacy, it's known by the end of the day, is to reach a result or to manage communication. And in the modern age, we have heard about different diplomacies of alliances or gumbo diplomacy, diplomacy of like brinksmanship, etc., etc. There is no need to delve into much details, and so therefore it's not strange really if there is some sort of a typical Gulf style diplomacy. In the past, Bedouin tribes used to raid one another's territory and livestock and things, and that followed the relationship between the sheikhs who ruled the area and his subjects. The problem arises when some people or some tribes found it difficult to give allegiance to some tribal chieftains, which developed into a political crisis later on between the Gulf countries. There's always been a necessity for some sort of a vehicle or problem-solving problem which is derived from the local culture. And this is the kind of diplomacy which we talk about when we say nose greeting, which is known in the Gulf culture, which was used in and culminated in the Al-Ula summit in 2020. I see some smiling faces because and the media hardly mentions this kind of diplomacy unless in a satirical way and followed with some sort of because traditionally when you kiss someone on the nose is interpreted by some as rather condescending. Some party sort of shows a tribal or Bedouin or desert or Gulf peculiarity, and shows that some person sees himself as of a higher rank or some sort of speak. But anyway, people don't usually look at this as a means of diplomacy. This is part and parcel of our life. It's always been there, and I don't think it will disappear any sooner. It's maybe there are similar forms in other countries. Maybe other societies know it in different forms, like the big brothers, or we see it in confederacies, we see it in trade families, we see it even amongst gangs, or sometimes they use their own methods to avoid all-out war and catastrophe. Some see it as some sort of an NGOs who can even have leverage over the state's apparatus and the legal system. In the nose greeting diplomacy, you do not respect respect any agreements in letter and in spirit as much as you respect what the feelings and harbored in the hearts and minds and the emotions of people, whether positive or negative, whether if you simply kiss the nose of another person as a gesture of apology, because the nose is considered the place where the person's pride and honor reside. So when you kiss him on his nose, it shows an approach of apology and respect and asking for forgiveness. So this is an old way of sorting out problems, and it can be the decisive moment. Sometimes long negotiations take place without producing much results. Sometimes a kiss on the nose can solve the problem, and later agreements will be worked out in detail. The late Sheikh Al-Jaber was known to practice that in his shuttle diplomacy, despite a lot of people either ignore, neglect, or make fun of this sort of diplomacy. I think there should be more attempt made academically to understand it and learn from it more. Thank you very much, and you took 7 minutes or so. This is perfect timing, and also this is a very nice paper, in fact, and you are also brief, so thank you, and may Allah reward you liberally for your efforts. Now we move from Doha to Washington. From Washington, we have with us Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber, Abu Jaber. He will be speaking about Gulf reconciliation and international competition in the Gulf region. Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber formerly worked for al-Sharq Center and editor of Arabian Peninsula. Now he's director of the Middle East and North Africa Center in Washington, D.C. He focuses on political science, public diplomacy, international communications, and international relations. He has published his research in many academic books and specialized journals, including the Encyclopedia of the World Press, say the official gazette. It's our pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Khalid. Please, the floor is yours. Good afternoon to you and to all our colleagues. It's my pleasure to be with you, and our thanks to the Arab Center for continuing the annual Gulf Studies Forum before the Gulf crisis and post Gulf crisis and before the reconciliation and post reconciliation. And I'm happy to be in touch with you, Dr. Abdullah, and all our colleagues. I listened to some of the interventions from this session and the previous session. So therefore, I wanted my input to be slightly different because of the very fact that I'm based in the United States, a bit far away from the scene, and maybe we see things in a different light. We lack nose greeting diplomacy here in Washington. We don't have the Sunni Shi'i divide, and in fact, although the Gulf reconciliation is present here, and many think tanks and centers thought that the GCC as a regime was about to collapse and fall, although after reconciliation there has been some different views in viewing this council, and in comparison it's probably better than every other Arab institution or any joint effort by the Arab states. Also, the declaration of Al-Ula summit provided us with a new glimmer of hope to our ability to solve our problems. We saw a lot of new steps taken between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and also the UAE joining also this track, and I hope that Bahrain will do that eventually. In any event, there seems to be unanimity on the view that the continuation of this divide and this rift, whatever name you want to give it, in fact, in the entire region for the last 10 years at least has been going through a very chaotic situation. And in the past, we used to say the Gulf region was the only stable region in the Arab world. These kind of positivities should be remembered and should be taken care of. The new developments and the changes, especially in the recent months following America's departure from Afghanistan after 20 years of involvement, has reformulated the scene once again and forced us all in the Gulf countries to rethink and revisit the idea of their reliance on the security equation based on the security and the defense of the Gulf should be pivoted on the United States. I think the manifestations in the Gulf countries, I don't want to say they want to sort of leave the mantle of the United States and its security umbrella, but maybe they are close to thinking that, at least, whether we look at the WikiLeaks or Obama's latest book and other sources of information of the communications of the State Department, which all seem to reflect that, by and large, the position by the Gulf states was one of disgruntlement vis-à-vis the United States attitude towards the Gulf, and especially pertaining to some events inside Bahrain and Oman, which also more or less started thinking along the same lines. This trend has started and it's growing, it's becoming like an ice ball, and if we go back to the 2017, when the first signs of the crisis started by pulling back ambassadors from Doha by Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the UAE, and then we entered into the real crisis afterwards, and we saw how new alliances started being made. Turkey has become present in the Gulf. There is a Turkish base, there are Turkish soldiers. So although Turkey is part of NATO, so if there was any fighting, then this could have created a lot of problems. Also, the main issue probably, and that is to do with Iran, and Dr. Mohammed has spoken about that and the role of Iran. But the way the Gulf countries have been dealing with Iran is different depending on each country individually. Oman and the UAE have political and trade contacts, so does Qatar with Iran, and also in the changes of 2017 because of the siege or blockade and the more openness from Qatar towards Iran, and also the recent talk of contacts and an attempt to find some common ground between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which do not seem to have been that successful, but nonetheless they have been in existence. And also the UAE and Bahrain's openness towards Israel and normalization of relations, and also Bahrain has managed to sort out its problematic relations with Israel for decades, and was not as successful in solving its problems with a near neighbor in the Gulf, and that is Qatar. Some people are on the right, some are on the left of within the GCC regarding these issues, and this has been a problem. This is a problem of divisiveness, and also when it comes to the policy of weapons procurement, and especially when the countries who supply the weapons started talking about human rights, and also openness towards China to a large extent, and maybe what the Wall Street Journal carried a week ago, that China is building a military installation that was discovered in the UAE, and the American intelligence agencies discovered that maybe this rang alarm bells when it comes to allowing a Chinese military presence or other military presence from other countries, because the United States is still present here. But if we look at the other side of the United States and how they view the situation, in fact, now that we have a different US foreign policy, which has a different approach than previous American presidents like Roosevelt, Truman, or Eisenhower, when it comes to rejecting isolationism and getting involved into globalization. But Trump's withdrawal from international agreements whether to do with Iran or the climate or anything else. And the inward looking policies left a legacy that Biden had to deal with. But it's, it's clear that from the political talk in the political classes in Washington, there is some sort of an ascendance of the progressive left, and especially when it comes to disengaging militarily from the Gulf, because they no longer see the United States as having vital interests in the Gulf. So there is a retraction in that, and also this has something to do with the alternative energy sources and not relying on oil. And maybe the situation or the equation is changed now, and the United States can provide protection, but for less effort and less cost than was known previously. Also, amongst the other points of view is the shift that the power in the Gulf and in the Middle East in general or is turning towards China and the East, and we saw some sort of a repositioning because the troops who left Iraq and some of the authority, military authority given to CENTCOM, now the other commands are taking more authority. Some of these authorities have been moved to Europe or Asia. Also, there is the presence of the internal factor, because today we see this internal factor at play, which is really pushing the political establishment in Washington against getting involved militarily abroad. And the United States will not join any fight on behalf of the Gulf countries. And the best indication of that and the best proof is the United States did not get involved when the Houthis attacked Saudi Arabia, or even in the days of Obama or the Trump, although his relations with Gulf countries was very strong. And now with Biden, the situation is even more difficult. So therefore, the United States vision vis-a-vis the area is different. And all this talk about these issues now is coupled by pressure from public opinion, and not only from established sources of opinion. And this is probably leading Gulf countries to rebuilding their alliances. But the problem is the Gulf countries themselves, between them, do not have a joint perspective or point of view, and especially in the aftermath of the reconciliation, we see attempts to internationalize issues and attempts to make deals behind the scenes. Yes, all of that is happening, but unfortunately there is no common view which can combine the Gulf countries to serve their own interests jointly. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Khalid. I really admire what you said and content, and also in your respect of the time lived until now. nobody exceeded the time limit. We have some room now for questions and answers, and this gives us an opportunity to engage the audience here with us. If you have any questions or comments, do we have enough microphones to go around? We start with Doctor from there.
Go ahead. Thank you very much, and I'm going to be very brief, and I'm not going to get into the GCC household. First of all, the state of Qatar, that was the island of Qatar, has become the Great Qatar, and I have seen al-Khayyarin in Kabul taking everybody behind him to make them leave Afghanistan. 120,000 persons. So thank you to the island of Qatar that has become the continent of Qatar and the Great Qatar. And I would like to clarify a number of messages, Dr. Abdullah. The state of Qatar has made an achievement. So the Qatar stood on its feet and it went through the blockade, and they say that Qatar, Iran, what had made Qatar resort to Turkey or Iran? I do not want to get into the GCC household, but I have a question who is an officer in the Kuwaiti army. So my salutations to Sheikh Jabir, who said, thank God, the military threat is no longer there. 74 martyrs are still on the canal, and I call upon the Qatari brothers to take them to Kuwait, because those people, they stood with us in the war against Israel that everybody is trying to normalize relations with. You talked about Iran and Turkey, but why haven't you talked about Iran? My deepest salutations, and I do not want to be lengthy, but my salutations to the Great Qatar. Thank you, Dr. Zakaria. One question from the middle of and then another question from the other side. We're going to take a number of questions, and I'm going to get back to you. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you. So Hussein Abdullah from Sheikh Johan Center, don't you think that the Gulf nose greeting policy, it is not going to solve the problem, particularly that crises are repeated from time to time between GCC countries. So in order to solve the problem, we have to have a reform of the GCC system. I think that the problem has been solved because the GCC has had enough. There is fatigue, and there are new interests for Saudi and Qatar, and also a divine will. Thank you very much. Athens defeated Aristotle. السلام عليكم. علي الرميحي from Juan bin Jasim College. I have 3 questions. My first question: what are the most important challenges that the GCC interests are facing? And the second question: what are the main reasons that make the Kingdom of Bahrain to be leading the scene? Is it within a agenda that is dictated on it, or is it emanating from the policy of Bahrain vis-à-vis Qatar? And what is the future of the GCC in the light of what is happening regionally? Thank you, Brother Ali. Behind you, please. I have a small comment. So, the Israeli intervention and the relationship between Bahrain and the Emirates and Israel are going to be another factor to the burden on the GCC and their relations. Are we going to see some issues rising to the surface? I think we have seen the model of Dubai and we have seen this bubble in Dubai. We need to have a real scientific development in the GCC that would secure the future of the GCC. So we do not want to lose the golden opportunity to establish a scientific infrastructure. So the consumption investment is not going to be useful if oil depletes. We do not want universities that issue studies and research for them just to be ranked amongst the best research centers. We want these to be materialized into work on the ground. Thank you very much. Microphone, please. I'm a researcher. I have a quick question. We have heard since the morning 4 or 5 interventions about GCC reconciliation. So I would like you to underline, where does the complex point lie? Are we talking about a number of knots? Because we talked about problems when it comes to strategic thinkings and transformations internally that have led to external transformations. And Dr. Khalid Al-Jaber said that there is no unified vision in the GCC. So where does the knot lie for us to be able to deal with it? Thank you very much. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, we would like to thank the panelists for their presentations. So there is a very important point that I would like to talk about. In my view, this is the other face of the same policy, which is the nose greeting policy. So how can we know this policy? Is this policy going to lead to good results in the interest of GCC countries? Can you, my name is Fawaz Al-Namar, yes.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور. شكرا أيضا للمتحدثين
Rashid bin Hamad al-Balushi from Qaboos University and a visiting professor at Qatar University. My question to Dr. al-Rumaihi. We talked about the system of networking for more than 40 years. We talked about the situation that is happening at the popular level. So in 2017, and we have seen this situation and what has happened, and also people tried to legally underline and prop up these arguments. So how can we go back to prior to 2017 when our GCC was one entity? So I would like to encourage also women to pose questions. Is it possible to prepare your questions when we come back to you in a second round of questions? And we'd like to start now with Dr. Dhafer. Perhaps you are the closest to me here physically. Can we start with you if you would like to respond to some of the questions or all the questions? I think two questions have been posed to me by the brigadier. So the number of crises that have been solved by the policy of nose greeting before the independence of the GCC entities. And after that, if we go back to history, we're talking about what we heard in the different councils, in the different majlis and dawawin. So the negatives of this policy is that it is not documented. So perhaps the nose greeting can happen at a pivotal moment and then solutions would follow suit. It is not documented, but it is much more important than you can imagine. It was the most important method or means of problem solving. So strategic balance, this point was underlined by Mr. Fawaz. I think we are achieving strategic balance. As a political institution, GCC countries are the kitchen, if we may so, where all these issues are discussed. So since the Arab Spring, so whether in attempts to stop the Arab Spring or to support the Arab Spring. So when we talk about the largest economic conglomeration in West Asia is in the GCC. So strategic balance, the bloc that is the strongest in West Asia is the GCC. So Iran perhaps is stronger in land forces, but we are stronger in air force and maritime force. So in my view, I do not think that strategic balance is not in favor of the GCC and that the GCC is the loser in such equation. No, it seems that some of us have not updated their information for some time. Thank you, Dr. Dhafer. Dr. Mohammed, we'd like to move to you first. Dr. Mohammed, can you hear me? There was no specific question that was posed to me. The last question was posed to you. I would like to start with the question that was posed by our brother from Oman. I do not own wisdom, but I think that this network at the GCC level is the result of the will of the people. Even the establishment of the council was also the will of the people of this region, working in education, health, media, efforts that have been exerted by Kuwait vis-à-vis other GCC country. All this emanates from this direct feeling of this will of GCC people. And it is now an economic necessity. Why? Because economic coordination has become key. And it is also a necessity for survival. If we do not agree to reduce the negatives and enhance the positives in the region, we're going to be targeted, one country after the other. And the pieces of information I have is that the countries of the GCC decided to deal with Iran, and they sent the former Minister of Foreign Affairs to Kuwait to talk about messages of openness. Our brothers in Iran said, we deal with you as states and not deal with you as representative of all GCC countries. So this matter, if we are not aware of, it will become problematic. I also said that cooperation with regional powers can be positives at some point in time, but it can have repercussions because these regional powers, they change their views between from time to time. So the gentleman who talked about scientific research, yes, I agree with you. We need to have scientific development, but scientific development, as you know, needs liberties, a large ceiling of liberties, and also a will to have scientific research. And from what I have read, a number of GCC universities have been successful in this regard. In Kuwait, we have the Scientific Advancement Institute, and I am member of some of its committees. This committee encourages scientific research, but is there a strategy for scientific research, a comprehensive strategy? No. We have read that there is development for this country or that country in the field of education, but I do think that we need to have a larger scope of work. So, strategic imbalance, yes, it exists, and some colleagues talked about Israel. And without entering into details, talking about Israel, we know that such an issue exists in large countries. I talk about Morocco, Sudan, Jordan, Egypt, and in the GCC, there are countries that have not announced and declared their relationship, but there are communications in this regard. And this topic needs to be revisited. Unfortunately, the Palestinians are also divided, and this is the catastrophe. We are all for Palestinian rights, but we have to think about how we can help our brothers, the Palestinians, to help themselves. And as we have seen, there are a number of political movements, Palestinian political movements that announce and build their regional relationships. Also, there is an Islamic Palestinian political party that is represented in the Palestinian government, and their colleagues are countering them in the other regions. So there is a chaos of concepts that needs to be discussed for us to be able to reach rational consensus. This is what I have written, Brother Abdullah, but I would like to come back and say that Mr. Zakaria, we kindly ask him to be a little bit, he should reflect some humility. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Would like to move to Washington. Dr. Khalid, would you like to answer some of the questions? In summary of what we have heard, we have three levels now. So the discussion is very healthy, because if we talk about the GCC, how many years have elapsed before the crisis? But the situation, the equations have become different. There are so many problematics today at the level of the GCC. They have to be put at the table. They should be discussed. We have had 40 years, and this system is still having so many shortcomings, so many problems that have not been resolved. I think we have gone beyond the stage where we do nose greeting and so on. I think we need to talk about the real challenges, because there are challenges. that they are linked to defense and security. So the system, since its beginning, so the 80s, it was the war with Iran, and then the 90s with Iraq, and then we have had GCC crises against Qatar after the Arab Spring. We have had crises and conflicts with GCC countries, and now we're talking about a reconciliation. The economy is still facing so many problematics. There are problems when it comes to borders and so on. Unfortunately, the GCC system has not been transformed, is still has not gone down to the base. It has not been materialized in terms of institutions. So it has not tried to gauge the will of the people. It is still captive to personal decisions. So what has happened in the GCC is the result of decisions undertaken by two persons, and the repercussions have been subdued by all those countries. So this is the problematic that we're still facing for after 40 years. I think we, as intellectuals, when we talk at the level of think tanks and research centers, we have to be similar to a scalpel of the surgeon that would try to cure and deal with matters properly. We have to exit from this rosy delineation of the situation on the ground. We have to try to be objective in the way we delineate the things. Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid.
You said that the GCC countries have not turned into, I don't know whether you meant they never become established or they will never come established. We have a couple of hands. I said we give priority to the ladies. Thank you. هي النعيمية from Georgetown University. My question is to Dr. Dhafer. I wanted you please to tell us your point of view, your perspective about the Gulf crisis. We do not know where this nose is so that we can kiss it to make up and solve problems of not, because the problem is not this method of diplomacy is not enough, and crises can repeat themselves. All of this is because the problem of protection is providing security for the region.
السلام عليكم.
السلام عليكم. Dr. Khair Diabat from Qatar University. We noticed that the compass in the Gulf countries when it comes to foreign policy has never been independent from the international influences. We know there are very important projects led by the United States, for example, the new Middle East, the EU's Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, China's Belt and Road Initiative. We hear that the Gulf countries are turning eastwards. Can the Gulf countries really afford to leave the umbrella of protection by the Western countries? And what consequences can we expect? Are there any hands raised before we give the floor back to our panelists to start responding. Okay, I think we should. The time is fast approaching, and our stomachs are feeling the effect. Can you just give me 1 minute, please? Assalamu alaikum. My name is Dr. Abdulrahman Khan. I'm from the Senegalese embassy. I'm an advisor there. We like to thank the Arab Center for this kind. We have with me His Excellency the Ambassador of Republic of Benin and a delegation from Mali, Dr. Khalid and Dr. Dhafer al-Ajmi came up with a new term, and that is the nose greeting diplomacy. I really would like to hear about this. Is this meant to be some sort of a cordial, non-formal, non-official way of engaging in diplomatic efforts? This is a new term. We would like some more elaboration, please. Going back to the Arab countries, there were four main pillars in history: Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. As you all know, there are problems now in the Arab Republic of Egypt, in Iraq, in Syria. So the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia now has become the only remaining pivot, if we can call it that, and or at least appears to be the strongest in the Arab world. In the near future, in the foreseeable future, can we expect more emerging powers, whether in the Gulf or the Arab countries in general? Thank you, Doctor. If you can start with your answers, please. My response to the doctor, I really bank on this form of diplomacy simply because of we cannot rely on texts and formal diplomacy unless we remove what's in the hearts and minds of people. I spoke for 10 minutes to explain what we mean by this term, nose greeting, but in the end, I concluded by saying we need some more formal academic research to formalize it in a way which can be presented to outsiders. Dr. Mohammed, Dr. Khalid, do you have anything to add before we conclude this session? I thank you, Dr. Abdullah. I don't have anything to add. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Dr. Khalid, do you have anything from Washington? Just one final observation. It's clear that post-Gulf reconciliation, or in practice, in brackets, Gulf reconciliation, it's obvious that countries in the GCC now are more focused on their individual interests rather than collectively as within the framework of the GCC, especially what the UAE has been doing, Bahrain what is doing, and also what the UAE with its new attempts to open up uh, on Turkey and their economic relations with Iran, which reflects that unfortunately maybe this kind of approach, whether to open up towards Iran, for example, may not be met with approval in Saudi Arabia. Maybe definitely Saudi Arabia would not approve of that, because this is what you can deduce from the statements in the media in Saudi Arabia, and also the normalization of relations with Israel, and especially from Kuwait, Kuwait or Qatar. Qatar also has been trying through the work in Gaza and the West Bank to reach some sort of an understanding, but unfortunately, these big issues are not dealt with collectively. They're not even put on the table in the meetings of the GCC. Maybe within a month or so we will see meetings held by the GCC, and the only thing we see will be a final communique repeating the same old statements which we've been hearing for over 40 years now. Regrettably, this is so. I hope we can break this vicious circle and do something good. Thank you very much. If you allow me, please, I would like to give my personal opinion in this matter, and that is the Gulf area is going through a difficult patch. This is nothing new. Since the 70s, we are going through this situation. Gulf countries have very deep differences between them, and they are continuing and perpetuating. The crisis, the Gulf crisis, has proven to us all that we are going through a crisis. Maybe there are some peculiarities. We may practice in nose greeting or any other form of typical traditional diplomacy. None of this will do us any good unless we diagnose the illnesses properly, and the diagnosis shows that despite the challenges known to everybody, our countries as a whole, as a group, the GCC, have not risen up to the challenge, and this is not something peculiar to the GCC, the region as a whole, and even in countries which have democratic systems like the ASEAN or the EU, they are facing difficulties, although they managed to establish their work and institutionalize their work, and they managed to have a free media, free thinking. We manage neither of that. We don't have free thinking, we don't have free media. We still are in search of where the illnesses are. We haven't put our finger on it yet. I think we will continue unless we come up with other ways of facing up to these challenges. We invite our elite, our intellectuals to exert enough effort on that, because as a region we are in dire need of that, and it's enough talk about us being an exception. We are not operating outside the scope of history. We should be part and parcel of it. And on behalf of everybody here, please allow me to thank our partners. First, Dr. Dhafer al-Ajmi, Dr. Mohammed al-Rumaihi, Dr. Khalid al-Jaber, for their valuable contribution. And I thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for participating in this session and persevering with us. We are late few minutes for lunch. Thank you very much all, and my best greetings and regards to you all.